a dear friend of mine, he actually, and he's a Chinese guy, early on when we met, he introduced me to making challah. I had made it once with my sister in my life. We have a Chinese guy making challah with me. And he said, we could sell this on the street at the tourist town we live in. 20 years before, some Israeli backpackers came through that he met. What I like to say is 20 years before I was even like conscious, I was like probably 3 years old. Hashem had already like started the prologue to the story.
Welcome to Ordinary People with Extraordinary Stories. I'm Chana Weisberg, host of this podcast. Joining me today, we have an incredible guest. His name is Yaakov Schy. He is a Jewish writer and speaker who has lived in China for many, many years. And unexpectedly, it was there that his connection to his Judaism got reignited. He is now in the financial field. Yaakov, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Hannah.
Thank you. So you have a very interesting story, and a lot of it happens in China. But start us off where a little about your background and where you were born.
Sure. So I was born outside of outside of Boston in the suburbs, a very Jewish town, and it's typical like think Skokie to Chicago. I was in
Mm-hmm.
Newton of the Boston area. So
Mm-hmm. And what was your Jewish background like at the time?
yeah, so Jewish background was my family would probably fall into what we call
Mm-hmm.
conservative Jews. We had Shabbos dinners on Friday nights. We didn't keep Shabbos. We didn't keep kosher, although my understanding is my parents thought about it when we were born. Um, I went to Hebrew school after school 3 days a week. Had a bar mitzvah, but didn't rep to fill in. I read from the Torah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I learned my Aleph base, but I didn't learn how to read to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and my
Did you
oh, go
did you
ahead.
ever question your Judaism at the time? Like, would you ever think, is there something deeper?
At the time, I don't think so. I was more preoccupied by the fact that I had a very busy schedule during the week. I was a 3-season varsity athlete. I was involved
Mm-hmm.
in choirs and a cappella groups, and I was pretty serious about my studies.
Mm-hmm.
So I was more preoccupied with, I had to go I had to go to school after school multiple
Right.
days a
Sure.
week.
That must have
And
been
so
busy. Did you resent it?
yeah, a little bit.
Of course.
Um
Yeah.
I'll just give a plug to my mother though. She said, there was a desire to send us to a Jewish school, but
Mm-hmm.
it was just extremely expensive and that wasn't in the cards for her family. So
How
um
sad. Yeah, that's really sad.
yeah.
Uh, did you okay, so was your spirituality tugging at you, or at that point you were quite satisfied with the sports and all the music, all the other fields, the extracurricular things that you were doing?
So yeah, I don't think I felt any sort of conflict at that point in my
Mhm.
life. But I was kind of a spiritual kid. Like I grew up a little bit of background. My family have a lot of ties to Vermont, so spent a lot of time in the outdoors, doing all kinds of outdoor sports, hiking, biking, canoeing,
Mm,
camping, backpacking, and I think those experiences in nature certainly shaped my sense that when you get away from the noise of society, when you get away from the day to day, there is
mm,
something that emerges that's deeper. And
mm,
I definitely had that feeling, you know.
mhm,
Um,
mhm,
but I think past that, now my family may differ. I will say one of my aunts, she said, "Well, you were always like the kind of kid that would sit out under the stars at 11 o'clock at night in the
mhm.
summer." So I maybe to other people I was perceived as more seeking, but myself I didn't necessarily feel in a spiritual term that it was that
That you
was
were
what was
really
going on there.
seeking.
Yeah.
And what changed? Like, at what point did that change?
I think interestingly, at that point I was still sort of following the script in life. The script was go to high school, graduate, go to college, get a degree, and then, like, those 3 steps are supposed to lead you to, like, the meaningful, or at least, like, life which has meaning in
Mhm.
this. I do
Mhm.
think it can lead to that to some extent, but it was only about a year into college, and I started just thinking, I don't really see how this is leading me to the next step.
Mm.
I was studying social sciences, so it was very, like, strange to me. I said, "I don't know how I'm gonna get a job with these sciences," but my parents, in their best, desire for me, said, "Study what you want."
Mhm.
Um, and then I and several of my friends didn't like that only knowledge, quote unquote, that could be measured, quantified, qualified, studied, observed, was allowed for discussion in the confines of the classroom. So we started to say, this is supposed to be educating us, but this leaving out an entire area of the world, the existence that felt began to felt paramount. And
Mm.
in some way, I think it was just being in this antagonistic environment. Now, don't get me wrong, it was a positive experience, but being in this environment that's somewhat antagonistic to it sort of made us more stubborn. And at a certain point in my sophomore year, my friends and I were having a discussion, and we said, I think at this point, everything is so rational around here that the only rational choice to make is to believe in something that's irrational, that there's
Really?
probably
Wow.
something beyond us.
Like, what did you feel was being left out of your education? Like, which part? You say a whole field was being left out. What do you mean by that?
So, I mean, I think one was experiential knowledge, right? Like, I could go do something. I could be
Mm.
very sure that it happened. I could have all kinds of insights and stuff. But if we couldn't present it in a study with some academic who was
Mm.
reciting it,
Mm.
I had no standing for talking about it.
Mhm.
Um, and I think, yeah, I think, I mean, that was a major disconnection. The other part was just, like I said, I always say, like, when you go camping, or when I went camping, you're there, you're alone, you're with friends, whatever. You're cooking, the food is very, you know, minimal, modest, but it tastes even better because you're hungry
Mm.
and there's not much
Mhm.
around. And then there's always this aspect where you're sitting around a campfire. And if anybody, if you've ever sat around a campfire in the middle of the woods when you're camping, there's a dimension that is well beyond words.
Mm.
And I didn't know where that was landing. Maybe the closest you could get was, like, literary studies or something, right?
Mhm.
I didn't know enough to think, like, maybe philosophy would examine that. I didn't really understand there was religious studies. I didn't even know there was something called Jewish studies, which
Mhm.
is another, interesting
Right.
irony, but, so it was
So
kind
you
of
were
also a gut feeling. Oh, go ahead.
yeah, yeah, that's what I'm sensing. It was like this gut feeling, this, like, sense of missing something,
Sure.
but not really being able to identify what that something was. It was just this feeling that there's gotta be more than just
Absolutely.
yeah.
And I think it ends up, this is like, I won't jump too far ahead in the story, but just let's bookmark that intuition, because I think my spiritual journey follows very closely. First, it's a feeling, it's
Mm.
nonverbal.
Mhm.
It evolves to realizing there's symbols, right? Chinese is a symbolic language, and that
Mm.
tracks more with your mind when it's groping for meaning but doesn't have words. From symbols, it translated into words that I was discovering in Chinese, and eventually from words, it just translated into thoughts and action and brought me back to Judaism. So there was a very
Oh,
interesting thread going through this.
right. Yeah, there's a pattern there. Wow, that's so interesting. So, how did you get like, at what point did you decide to go to China? Is that the next stage, or am I jumping?
No, not really. I mean,
Mm.
um, someone told me that they're like, "Your story sounds like that episode on Seinfeld where they just say yada yada yada," and then I went to the next phase. But um, that kind of covers the college part. Now, college was where I started learning Chinese. I
Mm.
was the worst language student in the history of language class in high school, not because I was bad at languages, I just did not like the class. Say,
Mm.
like, "Let's learn Spanish." It was like, "Why are we learning Spanish?" Because it's a language. We didn't learn anything about any of the countries or, the culture, and I'm kinda glad for that for my neshama's sake at this point,
Mhm.
but, I had to take a language in college. So I was going around the table freshman year, when we still picked classes in person, and, I had to take language. Chinese teacher said, "Well, why don't you give it a shot?" And I had
What
a
made you
lit
choose Chinese? That sounds like a hard language to master.
Yeah, absolutely. So I did have a bit of an inside edge, which was I had spent some time traveling out of the US. Part of
Mhm.
that was in Southeast Asia, and in a matter of 6 weeks, I would write down every word that I'd heard and transliterated. I picked up about 500 words of Thai, which is about
Mm.
2 semesters worth of college, and I
Mm.
was able to converse getting around, like, basic stuff and have some, conversations. The thing that was similar to Chinese was 2 parts. One, it's a tonal language, which I can give a little insight into what that means if you'd like, but the other part is that it also the grammar patterns, some of them are very similar. So I said, "You know what,
Mhm.
maybe I have an inside track. I was pretty good at that, maybe I'll be pretty good at this."
Hmm.
Um,
So you started taking Chinese, and then you decided.
so I started taking Chinese and I loved it. I was just totally enthralled by it. It was extremely hard. Um, I spent probably about 20 hours a week studying how to write the words, because, you don't just learn like ABCD, you learn 20 seemingly random lines in a very specific order, and there's 10,000 of them, and they're all
Wow,
different.
wow.
Um, so I just got really hooked on Chinese. I got awarded a scholarship to take like a trip on the behest of the State Department with another bunch of students, which was like this all expense paid, like highlight tour of all the amazing sites in China where, all our meals were like 20 courses, just getting
Hmm.
wined and dined. It was incredible. So it's like you have an experience like that, obviously going back wouldn't be a question. So throughout my college experience, I incrementally went back. I spent a summer in Beijing because I really wanted to get immersed in the language. And after college, um, I just had a goal of learning the language, and felt that since I'd understood how to travel on my own, I could just spend a lot less money,
Mm.
going there and living on my own rather than trying to pay college tuition. So I just made a point to get out to China after I graduated, and I knew I had to be in an area that was not with foreigners, so I was pretty comfortable living off the land, if you will, from camping, and I lived in a very rural area for college. So I just said, "I'm gonna find a way to get to a rural area. Nobody's gonna speak a lick of English, and let's see what
Hmm.
happens."
That was
And
very brave, wasn't it? Like, to just pick up and move to somewhere?
Y yeah, yeah, it was.
No connections? I mean, or probably very few connections or
Yeah, no,
none.
I mean, yeah, I had a couple Chinese friends, they were kinda scattered about the country. It's but yeah, pretty much, I think my confidence came from knowing, like, "Hey, I could just pitch a tent, buy food, and doesn't really matter if I have a place to stay, I'll be
Mm,
fine."
mhm.
I'm just gonna give a caveat, not my ideal anymore. But it
Yeah,
is certainly something I'm more than capable of for, a stretch.
right.
Um,
But
and
what
yeah,
did your parents think about that? Your parents, your family, your friends?
yeah, you can imagine. I think everybody was a little concerned. Um,
Right. Was there a
everybody
time limit of how long you were going for?
it was open-ended.
Open.
I
Mm,
just said, "I'm gonna go and see what happens."
mhm,
Um, yeah, it was open-ended, and that sort of comes out later in the story, but without getting too far ahead of myself, I remember I called my mother and I said it was, like, about 9 months in, I said, "Mom, I think I'm just gonna stay."
mm,
And the thing is, bless their hearts, but I understood, well, I didn't take a dime of, support from my parents, from friends through
right.
that. So it's like, "Hey, I'm supporting myself." So
Hmm. And
there's really
how did you support yourself in China?
yeah, so I did a bunch of different jobs. Initially, I had an internship with the Chinese Academy of Sciences.
Mhm,
Um, my undergraduate was related to, like, anthropology and kinda understanding, and I started to get more interested in, like, farming, which, like, you don't need to go around the world to learn that
Mhm.
living with no electricity is not that, ideal, but it's a good experience. Um, and so I kind of talked my way into an internship, and then that ended. I needed to pivot, and I sort of supported myself doing odd jobs. There was a lot of opportunities to work as like a hiking guide for like some student run programs, and I never taught English. I just didn't enjoy it.
Hmm.
It's a whole nother story.
Hmm.
I worked with a friend together in a homeschool teaching like physical sports. I taught wrestling and hiking. And then the other big one, which is like, probably a very unique story, is a dear friend of mine. Um, he actually, and he's a Chinese guy, early on when we met, he introduced me to making challah. I had made it once with my sister in my life. They have a Chinese guy making challah with me, and he said, "We could sell this on the street at the tourist town we live in." We did it a little bit, and we were like, "Whoa,
Wait,
that was."
why how did he know how to make challah? Why did he even think of making challah?
Yeah, 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 exactly. Like, what? So
Yeah.
let's rewind 20 years before. Some Israeli backpackers came through that he met.
Mm. Mhm.
And he's a very spiritual person,
And
very
where was this exactly? This was in the rural areas of China or in the city?
um, Southwest China. So it's
Mhm.
a rural area. It's known as one of the most beautiful areas in all of
Mm.
China. However, there are towns that are like attract travelers and a
Mhm.
lot of Chinese. So he kind of based himself in those towns doing what he was doing, and you know, he was always an early adopter thing. So I think he met them through couch surfing when it used to be, person to person. So they
Mhm.
came, they stayed with him, and uh, an Israeli woman named Rivka
Hmm.
taught him how to make challah. Now, total coincidence, if we want to call it that. I wouldn't even think of this connection, but my daughter's name is Tzila Rivka. So go
Oh,
figure.
wow. Wow, look at that.
Yeah, he was quick to point out to me. He said, "That's who taught us how to make challah." I said, "Wow." You
Wow.
know, so
Wow.
what I like to say is 20 years before I was even like conscious, I was like probably 3 years old.
Mm.
Hashem had already, like, started, the prologue to the story,
Isn't that amazing?
yeah, set the step there, so 'cause you I mean, it's a 1 in a billion chance, like,
Yeah,
that would
what's the
not
likelihood?
happen. Some
Right.
some person trying to ask you to make challah in the middle of rural China is very strange.
So he
Uh,
learned from this Rivka how to make challah, and
yeah,
so he suggested to you that what?
so
"Let's make challah?"
he pretty much, I visited him, a friend introduced us after my internship ended in the Academy of Science. She said that, like, "Why don't you go meet this guy? He's a very interesting person. You might like him a lot." So I said, "Okay, fine." I did, like, I went to say, I did what I hadn't done through much of my 20s. I actually listened to her. Um, and so I went, we clicked, and he knew I was Jewish, and he had some interest in like, like just the Bible in general, and like Jewish culture. And so I was leaving for my stay with him, and on the last day he said, "Do you wanna make challah?" And I'm like, "What's going on here? Like, what?"
Mm.
It's like if, you're in the middle of China and someone's like, "Would you like chicken soup with matzo balls?" It's just like, "This is
Right.
crazy."
Right.
So I said yes, and then we met up a couple months again later, and we said, "Let's try and sell it in the town that we're living in." And we literally had a basket full of chalots, small ones, and we walked out, and in 30 minutes, maybe we had 30 or 40 of them just completely gone. And,
Mm.
like, by Chinese standards, made a solid amount of money that it was like, "Whoa, we could just do this."
Mm.
Um, and then my visa
And
expired.
who were the people that were buying it? Was this Israeli backpackers or was this Chinese?
90% were Chinese that were
Chinese,
visiting. Yeah,
interesting.
it was very, exciting
Very
for
unique.
them. Yeah, they
Right.
they never had it.
Exotic. Mhm.
Yeah, exactly, and
Well,
even
what could beat homemade challah, right?
yeah, exactly, and we did it. It
Yeah.
was right around Rosh Hashanah when we started, so I made it with, like, honey in it, so it was more sweet.
Uh,
So,
yeah,
yeah, I
sure.
mean, we would literally have people coming from parts of the town, like, it's like a cartoon. They said, "We just followed the smell here." I was like, "What?" And they would
Wow.
come and buy it, so Just very
Wow.
funny experiences.
So do you feel that that was a pivotal moment in your story?
Yeah, absolutely. Interestingly, that I didn't feel as much was transformative in like a cognitive way on the Jewish journey. I think in hindsight, and this is where it starts, to send the shivers, down my back. I can tell you 100% I really didn't know about Chabad. Okay, if you asked me what it was leading up to that point, I probably would have said like you're talking about like the bread, like ciabatta or something. I really didn't know anything about it. Okay, somehow while we were doing this, we were selling this bread. And I wouldn't have had the word, but I felt like I was on kind of like shlichus. Like, yes, it was Chinese. Occasionally, we meet some backpackers that were Israeli, but the idea that we were kind of living let's call it like a little bit more of a different life than the ordinary person. We were sort of supporting ourselves and living in the countryside, and we would meet people and we would say, "Hey, like you want to have like we want to talk to them as we're selling this bread." So we talk to
Mhm.
them a little bit. They're traveling. They come to this town to kind of get a sense of something different from their own life. And if we struck up a conversation with them, say, "Why don't you come, tomorrow? You'll make bread with us. It'll be enjoyable." And said some of them would say, "Okay." So we'd sit and we make bread. It'd take 3 hours. We had a massive basin of dough, and then say, "Oh, was that enjoyable? You want to come sell with us?" Okay, so then why don't you come back for lunch tomorrow? Next, it was very interesting. It was
Mm,
really like a shlichus, and I felt that I was finding a lot of at that point, I was very interested in Chinese. And I think because I wasn't a person that grew up with it, I could see things that were very distinct about the language that revealed really tremendous insights into Chinese culture and things like that. Um, and I would share that with some of the Chinese that would come and they'd be like, wow, I never thought about that. This is interesting. So there was sort of these, in a Chinese framework, spiritual sort of ideas floating around but let's say, that's all as far as I'll say it was shlichus, but the spiritual kind of root of it felt very much similar to that.
interesting. Like a spiritual root of sharing with people and getting together with that comradeship.
Yeah,
Were you believing in God at the time?
it's a good question. I think I felt that there had to be something else
Mhm,
that met that beyond what we could see. And that's in
mhm,
fact really what kept me in China for so long. In China, in the States, it's sort of like, yeah, there's society and then there's like people who believe in religion and like those are kind of separate. In China, okay, it's definitely not believing in God, but the foundation of all of the civilization is based on an unseen world where there's forces and there's spirit and there's, energy as it relates to the seasons and acupuncture and medicine. And I felt in many respects it was much easier emotionally to be there because I didn't have to fight to prove that it was that like that part of existence was real. It was in the
mm,
everyday.
mhm,
So that's probably where I was holding that there were definitely forces in the world that were not seen. But in the sense of like, as I understand it now, mm, I didn't think I have a relationship at that point. I
mhm,
think I felt that there was definitely something well beyond us that probably shaped events, but it wasn't like a personal relationship.
mhm.
Um,
It wasn't a relationship with God, it wasn't something that you felt God was acting through you or that you could connect with him.
yeah, yeah, and
Mhm,
I didn't know enough about Judaism to really understand like how that was
mhm.
accessible, right?
So what changed? Like, at what point did things change?
So things really began to take off when, um, as part of my internship, just to give people like signposts, Hala came after the story I'm about to tell.
Mhm,
Um, but the catalyst for the change really came when I was working as an assistant on a trip to a country's Bhutan, which is a very little country that people may have heard of. Um, as part of a conference that was doing similar research that our unit was doing.
mhm,
Um, that trip ended up having a lot of contrasts that made me reflect deeply on where I was as a Jew and where I kind of felt like I probably ought to be.
Mm,
So I was with people from 6 continents in the world, my cohort. All of them were like from very little places on mountains. Um, they all were still working like rural lifestyles. And the object of the conference, just to give a teeny context, was for them to share like kind of their insights about what they were doing in their community for farming with what they
mhm,
were doing and things like this. But what I don't think anybody expected, and this is what really hit home for me, was instead of the conversations beginning at like, okay, so what do you plant? What's the best crop in your area? Great. The first day just started with everybody talking about their spiritual beliefs and how that tied to how they live their life.
mm,
And so I'm sitting there listening, trying to do some translation for my cohort. And there were some, most of the people that came, they came with people that were, had grown up in sort of like the modern world. It was like an interface between the two. And several people made comments to me. I think I might have mentioned I was Jewish or something. And like each time, there were some moments where, like everybody was like at a temple and they were trying to pray because there was rain that wasn't, and there was like not enough rain, or the rain was too much. I don't remember. And someone came up to me after that and they said, I'm surprised you didn't pray. Like,
mm,
you're Jewish, and it was like, what? You know,
mhm,
that's very strange. I may have said a few words, but it was like, it just very didn't hold much. And another time we were like on a bus and we were at a bus stop, which bus stop is a generous explanation. It was literally just a dirt road on the side of a mountain. Um, but I was with a couple guys that were from Tajikistan and northern India, and this guy's just wearing his traditional dress, the long kind of down to the foot kind of robe, and he's wearing the skull cap. And he looks at me and he says, "What's your traditional dress?" And I'm just sort of
mm,
dumbstruck. And
mm.
then he points to both the labels on my chest and my pants, and he says, "North Face and Patagonia." And just like, wow, you know?
Wow.
Like,
Yeah.
thanks. And I think I've always been a person that's, um, willing to question my own thinking as a regular practice. So it was impactful. I'm not gonna say it was like the light broke over my head, but I knew enough to think like, "Yeah, you know what, I probably," like, "Yeah, he's probably right." Like, there's probably nothing there, as I currently stand. So
That
the
that's
la
an interesting I mean, that's quite a punch in the gut, like, to say, like, North
Yeah,
Face, like, is that your identity, the designers that you're wearing or the labels
yeah,
that you're wearing?
yeah. And I think part of it resonated though fairly quickly because I was already starting to wonder and realize, okay, I grew up in America. What's my culture?
Mm. Is it
And
just materialism? Is it
it
just,
pretty much
the
as like, is
pursuit
it
of
McDonald's hamburgers? Is it
Mhm,
banking? What is it? So I
mhm,
knew what it wasn't. I
mhm,
don't think I had an answer exactly what it was, right?
mhm,
Um, there were 2 other events on that trip that were extremely impactful. Um, the 3rd one was during one of the stays in this little mountainside community. We had local guides, and they were young. They were in their 20s. Um, they were very settled in their life. All of them, I think, were married, but they were taking time to help us with this trip. And late at night, again, this is why I say they brought up the campfire story. So we're in this big, giant gazebo, in the middle of a jungle, beautiful forest. Just to give a little context, they took pine needles that must have been almost a foot long that were all brown. That was our bedding, just pine
mm,
needles. I mean, it was an
mm.
incredible setting. And so everybody started singing songs and this and that. And, I'm musical. I enjoy music. So I appreciated it. And, the singing was going on. It was like 45 minutes. Okay. An hour. hour and a half, 2 hours, and I'm just in my head, I wasn't bored by it, but I'm just like, "This is incredible, they're still singing, like, how do they have so many
Mhm.
songs to sing? Where does
Mhm.
this come from?" It was very strong reflection when I started to think, I can't sing the songs from my civilization, from my people, like, I felt that was a stark bad sign, I'll just say. It was like, "Wow, this is tragic." You know, I
Mhm.
I can't every person should have I had this very strong conviction ever, every person should have this ability to I mean, right, when they say that the pen is the whatever of the heart, but the
Mhm.
music is the expression of the soul or something, whatever the saying is.
Mhm.
And so eventually after like 3 it was like 2, 3, 4 in the morning, and I asked him, I says, "This so something's kind of incredible here. You guys have been singing for like 5 hours." It's like,
Mm.
"What on earth have you been singing for that long? How is it even possible?" So he said, "Well, first we started with the old songs." He said, "When we finished that, we moved to the new songs. Then when we
Mm.
finished that, we just started making up songs. We take
Mm.
some of the old and some of the new." It very much resonated with me, like, wow, okay. Like, I don't have that. It's a tragedy to me. Some of my earliest experiences with spirituality as a kid were also around Jewish music. I guess I should mention that. Incredible
Mhm.
cantor at my shul, and they're very transcendent listening. So I sort of resonated with that. So that was extremely impactful. I was just like, I am not living a like authentic life in my own culture without that.
Mhm.
It's crazy.
Mhm.
The
Mhm.
last story, and it kind of is a nice bridge, it was the final day of this conference, and the final day of this conference, and there was a presenter, and she was a woman from a small tribe of Taiwanese, indigenous Taiwanese, so basically, and their name is Kanakanavu, and she was presenting about a recent hurricane that had hit where her tribe lived,
Mm.
um, and it totally just wiped out whatever was left of the infrastructure, shifted around the landscape, filled streams with sand, carved out like really major.
Hmm.
And similar to that thread of if a person in my culture can't even do this, what do we have left? And what I'll say it was she was on stage presenting in tears that after this hurricane, there's only 500 people left in her tribe.
Hmm.
We think we're a small tribe. We are a small
Mm.
tribe, but that's
Mhm.
another level.
Mhm.
Um, and she said, now that everything's been destroyed, I don't know where anybody is going to learn to do what we do. And specifically, now that the streams have been like washed out, she said her tribe, if there was one fundamental thing that you couldn't forget, it was that how to dig for clams in the river. Like this was a major cultural thing for them. She said, if
Hmm.
nobody can remember that, what are we going to do? We're going to fade out. And, she's like crying about this.
Hmm.
That was the point. I was sitting next to the one of a person that became a friend in the conference, and I was just starting to cry. It was
Hmm.
very powerful, and the sort of cognition that came up was here she is heartbroken over the loss of her life, basically. I know I kind of I walked away intentionally from mine. And what
Hmm.
would she do to have an option to go into that and prolong it? So
Mhm.
it was a very powerful insight. Later on, I would say it also very much reminds me of the story with the Baal Shem Tov, where he says, if you can't remember the words to the prayer, say the melody. If you can't
Mhm.
remember the melody, just hum. If you can't
Mhm.
hum, just stand in silence. And it's like it's very poignant, right? And one hand, it communicates the message that the desire, right? It doesn't really matter if it's there and it's strong. That's all you need to connect.
Mhm.
The caveat I'll add is you don't wanna hold at that being totally mute and not being able to do anything past that, but it really resonated later on in that context too. So,
Very interesting. So,
yeah,
like, I'm sensing there's this yearning in you, and there's this understanding that you don't have something that you're missing at.
absolutely.
So at that point, did you say, "Okay, I'm gonna go back to America and find out about my Judaism?" I mean, that's sounds like where it would be leading.
100%, and I think in almost every story it usually does. So that was, like, year 1, and so basically the short answer is it would have made a lot of sense to do that, but instead I decided to stay in China for 5 more years.
5 more years, wow.
Yeah.
And why was that? Like, how were you discovering your Judaism in China?
Yeah, so there's a little bit of progress after that trip. Um, I was definitely, I would say, yes, now I'm interested in Judaism, so I was
Mhm,
looking for books, material,
mhm,
anything I can get my hands on, and I stumbled across some books, and the books exposed me to some of the ideas of the Baal Shem Tov.
mhm,
And, one of the major insights is that, you know, everything is part of the orchestra of Hashem's, design, that he's really everywhere, and you don't really have to be anywhere to find him, to seek him.
mhm,
So now the context you have to imagine, I lived in, you know, when you think of like most gorgeous places on earth, this is the type of landscape that comes up. Okay, just to give a little context, I lived at the foot of 4,000-meter mountains. I was at 2,000
mhm,
meters. I could
mhm.
walk out my backyard and hike to the top if I wanted. It
Wow.
wasn't just one mountain. It sort of looked like what Jackson Hole looks like, a whole stretch, a whole spine of mountains amidst a big plain. Now imagine
Mm,
the plain of the in front of it was a patchwork of farms. So you have these beautiful different plots. Down further from the farms, you hit a giant lake. The lake was
mm,
130 kilometers around. I biked it, 130 kilometers around. Across there, you're seeing red and green cliffs. And far to the north, if you were to look like left, you will see snow-peaked mountains in the distance. These
mm.
mountains were the tendrils of the Himalayas, right? The southern
Gorgeous.
tendrils.
Wow.
And the skies every day were paintings, and at
Hmm,
sunset, the clouds would just roil on the top of the mountain. Just they would go to the top, and because it was colder air where we were, they would hit, and then they would just recycle back. So you're just watching this mural, a canvas before you. So when you say God's everywhere, and I'm sitting there, I'm like, "I'm here, baby. I'm
right,
there."
sure. Wow.
It was extremely, but we have that kind of theme in nature, so that was part of it. I was just like, "This is incredible. How could I leave?" It's just,
Right.
but I also had a distinct feeling. I said, "Well, I don't need someone else to explain to me how my connection to God works." Now, I think a little bit differently than that now, because I think a person ought to learn
Mhm,
how it works according to where they're from. But more to the point, I very much resonated with, like, the aspiration of, like, sort of the yeah, the Abraham story where he sort of pieced it together on
mhm,
his own accord. He
mhm,
came by proof of logic looking around and said that there's something out there. There's something bigger.
mhm,
I didn't want my experience to be tainted by somebody else's understanding that I wasn't sure was correct, that I wasn't sure they had a motive, that I wasn't sure about anything about where it came.
mhm,
I learned some insights and I said, I'm just going to dig into myself. You know, I'm, I really resonated with like Yitzchak. I'm going to dig the well in myself. I'm going to redig it and go deeper and
mhm,
deeper and deeper and let the water, make it so deep that the water is just always going to be there. And then I have to figure out how to deal with it. So
mhm,
I very much felt, and also I felt that the lifestyle was set up. I was able to work part time and devote the other part of my time to exploring any academic, intellectual, spiritual pursuit I wanted, um, which was in part Chinese medicine and how that works.
Mhm.
So, you know, in a certain sense, I just got lost in it, not in a negative way. I mean, it's incredible system, and it's the more you get into it and you more see how accurate it is, it's just like so I was just occupied by the day to day. It was fascinating, it was beautiful, it was rich.
Right. So it sounds like it was very rich and very spiritual and very meaningful, but, a person could get kinda lost in there, like,
Yeah.
meditating in the on the Himalayas,
Yeah.
on the top of the mountaintops.
Yeah,
But
yeah.
Judaism is so much about doing as well, and mitzvot are
Absolutely.
all about doing. So how did you transition from that to actually looking like you do today? Like, you don't look like someone who sits on a mountain just meditating, but someone who actually does Torah and mitzvot.
Yeah, yeah, and works in the financial district of
And
Chicago, you
works
know?
in the right, okay.
Talk
That's
about,
quite a transition. We'll talk about that too,
yeah,
yes.
yeah, 180. So, you know, again, yada, yada, yada. Many years went
Mhm,
by of me in these kind of states, but I was approaching 30, and it ended up being my last year in China, which was like 2018 to 19. Um, I decided I wanted to learn martial arts. I wanted to learn Tai Chi, which is a whole another thing, but I have like 25 years of martial arts and wrestling experience, so it was fairly I wanted to learn it for the medicinal reasons. So I was kind of scouting out where I could learn and, I found somebody that I thought might be, worth learning from. Now, it sort of gives you a hint of where my head was at then because when I was in China that year, I had spent some time back in the States for really no reason that I could explain. I was adamant that before I left for China that last year, I bought tzitzit.
mm.
Didn't ever wear them in my life before, but started wearing them when I was there. Just total
Just something pulling your soul.
something took me over and I did it. It wasn't me that was doing it, which is another question. So when I talked to this teacher, I said, so tell me, I just have one question for you. What's the source of the knowledge that Tai Chi comes from? And he said, obviously it's some divine source. I said, okay, cool, you can be my teacher. It
Mhm.
was like, at least if we're on the same page, it may not be your worldview, but if you can say that probably is coming from something that's, beyond human recognition totally, then I think we could learn together.
Mhm,
So I spent a year intensively learning with him, 3, 4 days a week. And then mind you, it was all in Chinese. So we
mhm,
discussed, all just every aspect of life. He was a true teacher. He didn't care what you were talking about. He's like trying to get to know you for you. We discussed all the finer points of like metaphysics and Chinese and philosophy and Western ideas and this. And then we would practice 2, 3, 4 hours a day of doing Tai Chi. And then I would work part time and it was pretty good. Like some people, that's a good life. And it was. But I was approaching 30 and whether it was it was like something naturally started to say, I guess there was 2 points, one other that I should say, but I start to naturally think about like, okay, where does life go from here? Is there marriage? Is there what? Mind you, the last year in China I already kind of made a choice. I said, I can't go back. I said, if I go back to that town where I was selling challah, I don't think there's anything that will propel me to grow there.
mhm,
It's beautiful, it's incredible, but I had seen friends of mine and I just felt that everybody that remained was kind of stagnant. I didn't see
mhm,
them seeking more, pushing harder. So I said, no, I'm going to go still the same province, but I'm going to go to the city. It'll be hard. I don't love cities, but I'm going to go to the city and figure out some opportunities there. And so that was a big transition already. Something I think was like a biological clock or something. But the piece that really sealed the deal was I was talking with him and, I'm starting to think about marriage. So we're just talking about marriage and he's telling me, well, this is what it looked like in traditional Chinese society. And like I'm getting deeper in and I'm like, starting to have this understanding. Like I don't think look, I love, you know, the friends I have in China, but I don't really think civilizationally it's just not really like compatible. It's kind of like an either or. I couldn't imagine being Jewish and also trying to somehow blend that with Chinese, and I couldn't imagine trying to do China and blend that with Judaism.
Mhm.
Um, so I was like, had this feeling, I can bend so far, but I can't break. Like
Mhm.
fundamentally, at the end of my journey, I started to accept two things: one, that there's a very Jewish part of me, and two, there's a very American part of me, and that the
Mhm.
American part of me also wasn't going to go away. That as
Mhm.
much as I wanted to be sort of more collective minded and honoring our elders and whatever, like Chinese people, I was American, and there was parts of me that just pushed against that. The individuality, the desire to just sort of, you gotta go your own way. But
Mhm.
what really happened was I'm a Kohen, and I think I learned a little bit more about it, but I understood a little bit more about it, but I understood that, I don't know exactly at what point it became realized. I knew I was a Kohen, but I understood that I can't marry a convert. So
Mhm.
effectively, I couldn't marry anybody in China. Right?
Mhm. Mhm.
Of a billion point six people, I couldn't marry a single one. Um, and that was the big turning point. I said, I have to go home. I have to
Mhm.
go home. If I've been so earnest about living a life according to my values that I went all the way to China and I stayed doing this rural thing and I adapted my whole life to what I thought was right. If I think this is right, then if I don't go home and live this, then what am I doing?
So at
So
that point, it sounds like you were already keeping Torah and mitzvot, because otherwise, why would you care?
I was keeping a little bit. I wasn't doing it totally. I would have Shabbat. I wouldn't go out and do anything. I would
Mhm.
read a lot of stuff on Chabad.org. I would
Mhm.
light candles. I don't know if I would have bread, but Shabbat, I started to keep Shabbat, in my
Mhm.
way.
Mhm.
I
Mhm.
start to wear a kippah.
Mhm.
Um, I think that was pretty much
That
where I
was a
was
turning
holding
point.
then,
So you
you know.
came back to America, and then what did you do? Like, how did you get more into your Judaism?
Yeah, so I came back. Um, I had to get my head on straight. It's a big transition from a third world
Mhm.
country to a first America to China. It's very different. Um, so I spent about 9 months. I stayed by my parents for a few months. I moved out to like a relative's house for a few months. All of it was progressing towards I eventually moved to the kind of Orthodox neighborhood in the Boston area.
Mhm.
Just to show you the level of like ignorance that I had when I was growing up, I had no idea this neighborhood existed.
Mhm.
I would have
Mhm.
thought you were kidding or, like, making it up if you said black hat wearing Jews existed in Boston. Literally
Right.
0. Did not know existed.
Right.
Mind you, it's on the border of my town.
Interesting. Wow. And how did you get to Chabad?
So, that happened a couple ways, but probably the earliest connection was, I was, like, looking at the website, so it's funny to be, like, I watching your interviews and reading articles, and now here I'm talking on the show, so
Wow.
strange how the world
Amazing.
works. But, some very close family friends of ours who were in our kind of nucleus of Jewish families, we had what was called a Havurah growing up,
Mhm.
and they were one of the families. They got connected to Chabad in our hometown. Um, they were big supporters of the shul there, and they kinda had this intuition that, like, I should probably connect to them. So they made an effort to, they'd invite me to, um not the semester kinda learning courses that JLI puts out to, go with them, and
Mhm.
they're like, "We'll pay for it as long as you will come to 6 out of
Mhm.
8 of them." I said, "Okay, that sounds pretty good."
Mhm.
Um, and the rabbi there is a very, very, very nice man. I'm close with him, he came to my wedding, I stayed by them for Pesach. and
Mm,
that was, like, point of contact. Um, but he's not in the town that I moved to for the Jewish. That's where he grew up, though.
mhm,
So, he pointed me in the direction of the shul that I ended up becoming very, very close with, which was a Russian Chabad house in the Boston area. Um,
mhm.
that's where I'll say really my connection came. Um, it
And
was
that's where I understand you met your wife as well.
almost. I met my wife. It wasn't at that shul, but for sure, in part because I went to that shul. So my
Mhm,
wife, her parents are former Soviet Union. They're from Ukraine. She was born in the States. I liked the Russian shul because at that point I'd lived outside the US for so long and I'd been in such a third world country that I sort of understood the mentality
mhm,
somewhat of the people that were there and I resonated with it. And they were just very, I mean, if anybody's met Russian Jews,
mhm,
very warm, very tough, but
mhm,
very caring.
mhm,
Um, as long as you're like a respectable person to them. And that's what I needed. I knew I said I I I need a place and I wanna be a respectable member of a community. I know that
mhm,
that's where my growth is gonna come. So
mhm.
and that's not easy, it's you have to go push yourself and go extend beyond yourself. So at about a couple years in, I said, I'll probably end up marrying a Russian girl, like, probably just happen, and
Right.
and 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 that ended up being a redeeming trait that my wife was looking for because she's Russian. She said when she was dating, she was too American for the Russians and too Russian for the Americans. So
Right,
then here was a guy who was like, "No, I kinda like the Russians, but I'm American."
right.
And
Wow.
so other reasons too, but that
Mhm.
really worked out. We met 5 months later, we were engaged, and another couple months after that, we got married, and then we had our daughter, our first kid this summer, so
Wow, beautiful, mazel tov.
yeah, thank
That's
you so
really
much.
beautiful. So, going from I mean, you transitioned a lot and you grew a lot and in a kind of unconventional way. You didn't go to the usual path of going to a yeshiva and going to the
Yeah,
regular studying. Looking back at how did you integrate, like, all of that together? When you came back to America, you had so much spirituality, so much interest and yearning. How did that translate into actually putting it into practice? How did
yeah,
that happen?
yeah. I think the first thing would to be say slowly.
Slowly,
When I came
okay.
back no, but I mean, it's important that when I came back, I had a maturity to say, "Okay, you can't change your mind the way it works in the
Mhm,
blink of an eye." And in fact, there are many people who get really into Judaism and then like they get really out of it very
mhm,
quickly.
mhm,
But it was hard. I
mhm,
had to figure out what my life was in the context of a place where I'm going to work, in a proper job. I had to figure out who my friends were in the context of moving to a community that I never ever had lived in before with people that I didn't even share that much. I didn't even know much about like, how to lead an Orthodox life.
mhm,
Um, the list could go on. How do I relate to
mhm,
my parents as an adult versus as like a young,
mhm,
somewhat a kid when I left? All these
mhm,
questions going through my head. How do I relate to myself based on the person I was to who I am today? I think I have a talent for synthesis.
mhm.
Um, so I
Well,
started
I mean, another thing that you synthesized, and that's really interesting that you work in the financial sector.
yeah.
So here you try to escape the materialism of
Yeah, yeah.
America,
Yeah, yeah.
and yet and now you're back in America and you're working in a financial sector and you're
Exactly.
doing physical mitzvot. You're doing
Yeah.
mitzvot with the material.
Yeah.
How did you bring that all together?
So I think that's a point I'm pretty proud about because it right, the way I see it is like so my name is Yaakov, but I think we have these Yaakov and we have these Esav energies. And for me, my struggle is to contain the Esav inside the Yaakov, to
Mhm,
balance the raw power with direction, focus, reduce it to where my focus is. So I knew I needed a job. I didn't, like I said, I studied the soft sciences. So I found an opportunity to kind of get into the industry fairly easily. So I started to work for one company. Um, and I was really interested in medicine, but I also, through, living with not too much funds in my bank account for many years, I understood, and you don't need to do this to understand it. It's sort of logical, but I realized how much a part finances were a part of health, right?
Mm.
Your
Mhm.
finances start going south, it's very hard to maintain your health. If you have any problems, it exacerbates it. And my big thing, my big passion at that point was really health and medicine, and considered going to acupuncture school, but I was 30. That means I would be in school till I was 35. Then I would have to start my own business and make it succeed. Now we're talking probably till 40, and I wanted to start a family and get married. I couldn't do it all. I couldn't do it
Mhm.
all. And I had the maturity to say it's gonna be one or the other. I kinda had to,
Mhm.
like, it was like a real test of bittul. It's like, "You know what?
Mhm.
Either I choose the Jewish way that I'm going, or I choose this career. They're not gonna work at the same time, not at this time
Mhm.
in life." So I chose Judaism, and it felt natural because health, in my opinion, a lot of it is coaching people to make small incremental changes and persist with those over time,
Mhm.
and eventually the health. Well, financial planning is very similar,
Mhm.
encouraging people to make
Right.
small steps. So I also had the insight, and this is where I resonated a lot more with my Russian friends, that I didn't have to do my absolute dream to be happy with a career that I was doing. I had to be
Mhm.
comfortable in it, but my meaning didn't come from the work that I did, which was a major important shift of my belief. I really suffered for that. You have to do, have to follow your dream to have satisfaction in life. I don't think that's true. I don't think
Mhm.
it's necessary. I think satisfaction comes from the eternal things that Judaism promotes. You can always do stuff on the side and see if it develops into something bigger. Like, there's so many ways to cut to cut the cake.
So
So,
where do you see your meaning today? Like, where do you find your meaning?
yeah, I think, I mean, everything. I my I moved. I was fortunate. It's Shem is very good to us. The way things worked out, it made a lot more sense to move to Chicago. It was very sad because I really became close with people in Boston. That said, I think Jewishly, based on where I'm holding, Chicago has tremendous amount more of opportunity to grow for in Yiddishkeit. There's a deeper community, it's bigger, it's more expensive. So, I mean, I'm living a life. I have a baby at home. My wife and I are married. We're trying to keep, al pi halacha as a married couple, which, as you
According to
know,
the
is
laws? Mhm.
hard. There's all kinds of challenges with that. I think I'm finding my meaning. I mean, I learn at a kollel a couple times a week. I have a chavruta that's one of our dear friends who's, grew up Chabad. I'm studying Hebrew.
Mhm.
The aspiration to both support and provide for my family and keep Torah and mitzvos is where I find meaning. That struggle is really where
Mhm.
the meaning comes, and that's why I'm proud of my decision to go into finance, because that's a far cry from what I was doing in China.
Right. It sounds
I
like you're
think
bringing God into your financial into your work as a f in finance as well, by realizing that you're doing it for a greater meaning and
I
purpose.
yeah, absolutely, and I think it shows a lot of growth and maturity, because
Mhm.
I would be a person that would say, "Oh, all the materialism, like, that's not where the meaning is." And I work in one of the most materialistic fields, but here's the truth. Money is on everybody's mind, and it's not
Mhm.
the end all, but it's a important topic. It's truly important, and you even see it today in the
Well,
Jewish communities, kosher
it's
podcasts for debt and things like
right.
that.
Well, it's what you do with it, right? Money could be used
Yeah,
for amazing things. It's bringing God into the money, bringing
yeah,
spirituality into the material,
yeah,
right?
yeah, totally.
Um, I'm wondering, like, you spoke so beautifully about your Chinese experience. I'm wondering, like, how you see Judaism, um, filled some void that you had in China. Like, in other words, you got a lot from your Chinese experience in terms of knowing that there was something more spiritual, but how did you find Judaism filled the void of what you were still missing in China?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the way that I can say it is for all the knowledge that I learned in China, none of it penetrated my core. It
Mm,
stayed in the level of my mind, stayed in the level of outside. Judaism, which I really had to understand when I came back to Boston, it would change me from the inside.
mhm,
And when I moved there, I remember having a very distinct thought as I'm sitting at Shabbos table of the family whose apartment I was renting, and I'm saying, I can't be a cultural anthropologist for this. Can't do it for
mm,
your own culture. Either it's participate and let it change you, or you're going to get nothing out of it. So I
mm,
think although I was enthralled by the knowledge in China, and ultimately I think it occupied a part of me, the emotional part I had to consciously divorce and sort of reorient that towards Judaism. But the soul part and the intellectual part, it didn't stimulate the Jewish soul. It didn't stimulate the Jewish intellect, which is where the soul kind of resides, anyways, according to Judaism. And that was the change. It
mhm,
really, once I started getting connected, I said, wow, I feel full in a way that no matter the heights I ascended in Chinese knowledge, the interesting insights I came to, that that nagging feeling just was still there. And when I
mm.
came back and started to learn more and more about Judaism, it went away. So,
And why do you think that was? Why did it go away? Was it feeding your soul? Is it feeding a part of you? Like,
I mean, if you believe in our, the tradition that we come from, we are designed for Torah.
mhm,
So it's natural. You know,
mhm,
it's I thought I was in my environment in a world that was like foundationally spiritual in China, but it wasn't the spirituality that was really designed for me, in my opinion.
mhm,
I'm not
mhm,
knocking it for sure. It's tremendous fields and worth learning for the merits of medicine and stuff. But for a Jew, I think there's going to be that empty feeling. And I'll also say one caveat. My other insight that I took from medicine, because you're asking how did I integrate this, was that if I was going to go into Judaism more, I had to do it in a balanced way. I couldn't
mhm,
say, "Oh, I'm just gonna hole myself up and learn forever and this," or I couldn't do this. I said, "No, I gotta have stability in my life. I've gotta be emotionally stable. I've gotta have a job that's stable. I've gotta have relationships in the community that are, respectable, and I've gotta be respected. I've gotta be a participating member, someone that people can count on, rely on, someone that they would trust to introduce to someone as a possible person to get married." And I knew I
mhm,
wasn't ready when I came back. I consciously said, "I gotta wait." I had to wait, like,
mhm,
probably a couple years at least. I thought about 5 years, and true to my thought, I got married at age 35.
mhm.
So, that
Well,
was also what gave me a feeling of s satisfaction was that I feel like I was doing it right. I was trying to
mhm.
develop the important aspects of life and do Torah.
Beautiful. I mean, it sounds like the spirituality of Judaism wasn't just a spirituality, but it was a spirituality that was a truth that filled every area of your life. So it wasn't just, okay, this is just filling my spiritual self, but this is filling my entire life so I could be a more balanced person, a married person, a working person, even a person in the finance district, because it's not a contradiction with the spirituality. It's not just spirituality, but the Torah was something that kind of fills everything.
Absolutely, and I mean, I think that that is definitely an insight that, Chabad really emphasizes, and as I started getting deeper into the Torah, at this point, I've been through the Chumash, on a surface level at least, 5, 6, 7 times since I started, reading the Parsha. And you see it's all over. It's all over Chumash. It's all over the first 5 books of the Torah. The challenge, the emotional challenge with how are we gonna live in the world and do
Mm.
spirituality.
Can you just share, like, the last question for you, can you just share something that you'd like that you would advise someone who's on their path or on their journey towards Judaism and is kind of, like, not sure where to take it? What would you suggest that they do?
Yeah. I would say 2 things, and in some ways they're the opposite of each other. The first one I would say is find people in a Jewish community that you feel are living respectable lives, get to know them, ask them questions. What would they do in these situations when they have questions about this? Meet people that they know that can help you grow because Judaism is all encompassing. There's not just one paragraph in Torah that's going to be your mantra for the rest of your life. It covers everything. So you need people that are well established, that are doing good in their lives and for other people to help guide you and orient you in a good direction. The other thing I would say though is don't lose sight. Well, I'll say that and I'll say make sure to listen to what other people have to say. If you came to the point where you're wondering about Judaism and you went through that challenge mentally and spiritually where you discovered that there is something more, that's a profound accomplishment. But don't end there. Ask
Mm.
people, listen to what people are saying. It doesn't mean you have to take what they're saying, but listening is one of the most important parts of growing spiritually. Listen to what they're saying, piece it together, ask your friends questions, start to find and get cued into some of the traditional pieces of our tradition. Start from third grade level, learn what people would learn at that level, like Rabbi Akiva, get connected, have Shabbos meals regularly, integrate into a community and you'll find what you need.
Okay, thank you so much for joining us. That was
Sure.
a fascinating journey, and we wish you continued success with your wife, with your child, and with your work, and with your continued growth in Judaism.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on your podcast.
Thank you. Thank you, Yaakov. Wow, what an interesting story from Yaakov. Who would think that it was in China that he actually discovered what he was missing and yearned for that? I found his stories from in China so interesting. It was there that he discovered challah, which he didn't even know what challah was, and how he learned how to make it from a Chinese man who had learned it from a woman who was an Israeli backpacker from years earlier. And that's clearly where you see the hand of God. And so often we see how God plants something in our path that years earlier, only for us to discover it years later in order to swerve our direction and to kind of push us in where we're supposed to be going. It was there in China that he started wearing tzitzit. It was there in China that he met that woman whose whole tribe had been decimated, and how she was crying for her loss made him aware of his loss, how he had that, but he had left it. He wasn't aware of it. It was the singing and the spiritual connections that made him yearn for his own spiritual connections. And sometimes when we are in a different place away from it, we realize so much of what we're missing. And that was what propelled him to really find it and discover it. I was very fascinated by his journey and the different turns of his journey, and how it was once he actually found Torah Judaism that he was able to integrate spirituality into his life. So he no longer needed to run away to the mountains of China and the rural areas and the farmland of China in order to find spirituality, but he can actually find God in a very balanced way in the physical reality and in every aspect of his life, in married life, with his daughter, in working even in the financial district, but doing it for a different purpose and for a different reason. And that was why it was no longer something that was just material. If you enjoy watching these interviews, I hope you are subscribed to Chabad.org/extraordinary. You can find us on all podcast platforms. Give us a like, drop a comment, I read every single one of those comments, and I'd love to hear what it is that you liked about the interview or what kind of um, things made you think about something applicable in your own life. Thank you so much for watching and for being part of this extraordinary community.